How German state TV channel ZDF or ZDF got YouTubed. Germany is a social market economy. This means we have two different sides. We have the market side on the one side and we have the social side on the other side. Now, those two, you could argue, are intertwined, kind of. And not only are they intertwined, but they also therefore influence each other. It is basically a mixture between socialism and a free market economy. A free market economy, for example, would be, or the best example for a free market economy would be the United States. And here we meet media. We have a big problem with media these days. Also with social media, which is actually not really social anymore, because the social aspect is not really there anymore. Therefore, it is just media in a new format. It is digital media, you could also say. Now, here is a problem. Incentives. In a free market economy, if you make a piece of content, then often, at least currently, how much money you make with this piece of content is determined by how... I couldn't write the N. By how much views this piece of content gets. Now, of course, views is just a measurement that is actually very simple, and it is used for how interesting the whole thing is and therefore how high the perceived quality actually is. If we define perceived quality as the difference between what a product delivers and on the other side what is expected from the product. So the higher these two align, or the more these two align, the more identical these two are, the higher is the perceived quality. An ideal product exactly meets the expectations, but not only meets the expectations, but actually exceeds the expectation, which is of course kind of combined in the expectation. A good product exceeds the expectation, you could also say. Here is now a problem. I'm not a psychologist, but it seems to be the case that human psychology is not really oriented towards the most fact-based thing, but has many things that are called biases. And also, it is not really interested often in the truth, but actually maybe in the thing that is the most discussed. What the exact evolutionary reasons for this algorithmic adaptation are, I cannot say. But there is a point to be made that things that are more controversial, which is things people speak about more, just are things people are more interested in. People also seem to be interested in all other kinds of things, often extreme things, not the things that are good, but the things that are bad. There is an argument to be made that if you have something on the good side here, then you need to have basically a multiple of good things compared to one bad thing to kind of reach the same level of engagement in our mind. Not only when it comes to media, but just in general. So now, back to media. When it comes to media, and when it comes to Germany, I think it is a very good example what media can provide. Because the social side here corrects the market, corrects the wrong incentives of the market. If somebody makes a piece of content and this piece of content is only driven by how much traffic it gets, then very, very fast, I would say, you begin to enter a cycle. And this cycle is basically a classical management cycle. So you try basically in different steps to first analyze, then see what is wrong basically. So you could also say this is kind of the same, then you try to improve, and then you try to analyze again. I mean, there are different variations of the general management cycle, but this is not that important. What is important is the outcome of such a management cycle. It is basically an adaptation to the market. Now, there are things where you really want to meet the audience's expectations, where you really want to cater a product towards what the audience actually wants. But there also is this thing called facts. And news, for example, one could argue, should mainly be fact-based. Actually, we have a really good example when news are not really fact-based anymore. And this example stems from this side here, from the market side, which you could also say these days, I now wrote the S the wrong way, is the USA. In the USA, there is often, within a TV show, a certain segment, and this is news. And the rest is people who have often not really the best ideas, or sometimes experts, sometimes not, are talking about this. And this is most of what is American news. This is something I recently heard. It's not completely based on my own year-long analysis of American news. So now, in Germany, we have this nice system. The problem now is that people don't watch the nice system anymore. People don't watch television anymore. So, in order to maybe explain this to a foreign audience, in Germany we have the government, and this government here collects taxes, like every other government, and a certain amount of these taxes, which are actually dedicated towards programming, go towards this programming. In the past, this used to be called GEZ or GEZ. Now it's called Rundfunk, which is the German word for broadcast, and the broadcast fee is called the Rundfunkbeitrag. Now, this is kind of a good system, I think, because it allows these media outlets to not focus on what brings in money, but to instead focus on what brings in truth, accuracy, basically a journalistic standard. The highest journalistic standard, ideally, is maybe the science standard, you could also say. So a scientific work actually has to adhere to the best standards. And of course, journalism in general is kind of a trickled down thing, but people just randomly stating facts without referencing them. And of course, there are different principles that combine themselves into this method of journalism, and also scientific research, and also scientific writing, and so on and so forth. And these different methods combine themselves into what makes up good journalism. Now, good journalism is destroyed basically whenever it is rigged by... It's not whenever. I just made a general assumption which I cannot prove. But I would argue that there is a reasonable assumption to be made that there are a lot of different influences that influence actually what the piece of content that is in the free market economy, not necessarily the US, but just in general, a free market economy looks like. And the worst outcome of something like this could be these magazines that talk about stars all the time, and usually I don't know how much of it is just not exactly the truth, but you could also say it's partially lying, but because they kind of know better that it is not really the truth what they are writing, but they are exaggerating, so therefore we are already kind of in this line. I now want to focus on the actual trigger that got me thinking about this and also now recording this. And in order to understand this, back to Germany. We have the government, and now we have kind of three main channels actually, which are simply called the State Television 1, State Television 2, and State Television 3. So State Television 3, to my knowledge, is usually owned and operated by the individual states within Germany. Then we have the second one, and then we have the first one. The first one is news, it's documentaries and so on and so forth. The second one is also very similar, it's also news and documentaries, and it's also kind of nationwide. And as I mentioned, the third one, I'm still getting adapted to writing in Mirror, is I think the most regional based. So we have some kind of locality on here, and of course these stations also are trying to adhere to journalistic standards. So now, one of these channels, the second one, is generally called the second one, which in German means das zweite. And the first one means in German das erste. And the third one, you guessed it, is called das dritte. Actually, when I grew up, we only had 3 channels. That's how old I am. And we only had 3 channels and not even a color TV when I grew up. So this is weird, because now it's completely different. And it was only like a few years ago, not maybe a few more years. So now, ZDF, which is das zweite deutsche Fernsehen, switching between American and German accents, has a format now on YouTube. And here is why I think now ZDF kind of got, and also state media in general, gets YouTube-bified, you could say. They have now a channel which is called Unbubble. And I know of this channel because I watch it. And why do I watch it? Because it's super interesting. And I know I don't learn anything from this. And it is usually just random discussion about actually very interesting topics. But one of the main problems with discussion is it is just not a very good fact-based information thing, because you actually have to constantly fact-check what everybody is saying. And not only what everybody is saying, but whether the rhetoric tactics somebody uses are actually rhetoric tactics somebody should use, or maybe also not should use, because they are unfair. They may just be a personal attack, for example, instead of actually a valid argument. And also, what is often happening is, so one of these tactics, for example, is straw manning. So somebody says something, and then the other person says a version of this, which the other person doesn't recognize is just a version of this, but then argues against this version, even though the person has said something different. And this happens all the time. And most people, I don't say most people, it is just very often the case that the original statement, the person that made the original statement, is then not realizing that he or she just got strawmanned. So now I want to talk about a specific video actually. And I don't want to talk about the actual facts that make up the video. I only want to talk about the format, because the other one would, I guess, be far too risky. And I don't want to risk me and my reputation for this. So this format looks like this, and we actually clean the whole slate right now. From a visual perspective, we have two different fields, and these two different fields are 9x9 fields each. So it's like this. And then we have people on here. We have in total 6 people, I believe. And these people can move forward or backward, not only in time. So they are, of course, not time travelers. It was just a joke. That didn't work. And these people can move forward and backward. What we also have is here we have a moderator. Now, these two are basically opposing camps to one view. So we might have people standing here, for example, in the beginning. I don't exactly know where they stand in the beginning. And somebody might argue for something in this camp, and somebody might argue against something in this camp. Now, if a person here says something and somebody here agrees, then they can move one field towards basically the other person, with the assumption that here in the middle is basically the agreement that has to be made. Of course, the agreement is not really made here. 6 people talking about a topic and an agreement then made is not really worth that much, apart from the exposure and apart from this media form it produces, basically. Now, 6 people talking about something and talking about usually very important topics is important, I guess. I mean, it is a part of free conversation, of free speech, of you being able to say whatever you want. But here now is the problem. The problem is that this is not a show that is 2 hours long and is a discussion with all these different people that would actually go into detail and then fact check maybe in real time whether this is actually true or not true, and so on and so forth. So what we have now is a mixture of a few different factors. And these factors are not provided by state media, which is trying to basically get rid of the free market side of the incentives that would otherwise drive media. So there are also other free private TV channels in Germany, and sometimes they produce very good stuff. Sometimes they produce trash. And of course you could argue that also the state media sometimes produces trash, but at least they don't produce that much trash, I would say. They have certain standards, and also by the public they are held to a higher standard. Maybe also because usually a German person per household, not per household, but one household usually pays almost $20 a month for state TV, which is kind of very much. It is basically almost 2 subscriptions of Netflix, for example, depending, of course, on which country. Maybe it is a Netflix subscription, but well. So now what we have here is a number of different factors, and these different factors are not provided by this correction algorithm that is state media, but are provided by the platforms. And these platforms now do a few things. First of all, they force a certain format down to time. Now, of course, this also is true for traditional television. Traditional television is not the best of all things. I mean, I think the ideal thing we actually would strive towards is a very scientific discussion about something, maybe in an even educational format, where somebody who knows something about something actually is the expert. And the other people just might listen instead of being something opinion-based, it would be more fact-based on this spectrum of opinion versus fact-based. So now, first of all, we have a drive for things to be short. Second of all, I would argue, there is a drive to enhance with video editing, with visuals and sounds, and to make something that is real, so that is real. That would be maybe a one-on-one. So if I record here, for example, I record in real time and you see it in real time, apart from me stopping in between. But if you now record something, then stop and then press record again, then you're already creating kind of a hyper reality because you're shortening the actual thing that happened. So visual and audio, I could also call this hyper reality, and I now also will call this hyper reality. So think of it, if you know Mr. Beast, for example, a channel that is very successful on YouTube. He basically strives off of this because this is what currently works. Because in a competition where there are people who upload real, actual social communication, you could say, and then there is somebody who cuts it down and makes it faster and adds music, dramatic music, then this person wins all the time. And this is also what they kind of have introduced. They have introduced sounds, for example, like dramatic sounds whenever somebody moves forward or backward, but not that much. Then there is also something else happening. And this something else is the spice that I call the control spice. And this is basically now the most important part of the video, even though I still have a few bullets on my bullet list. It's controversiality, you could say. Or how controversial something is. What is controversial even? It's something that is talked about. It sounds very similar to conversational, or at least looks very similar, at least to my eyes. Yet, it is something, I would argue, where there are two polar views, which people tend to have. Now, an additional factor is, if you want to get traffic, it might make sense to not only do these 3 things, but maybe a lot of other things also. But it might also make sense to focus on topics that are very low entry. And what this does is, I actually explain it, even though I now have to destroy my other nice drawing here, because I only have 2 sides. Just like a polar view often only has 2 sides, because it's a spectrum, therefore only 2 polar views. If you talk about a very technical detail, for example, about climate change and how to store energy during the winter, basically how to bridge energy to the winter, and maybe get batteries for the winter, but of course batteries in the long term for the winter don't really last that long. You could also use lakes and pump water up for the winter, and so on and so forth. And energy in winter is something that is discussed recently quite some. Now, here is the thing. Out of all the different people had different interests. And let's say just a person has 100 interests. The thing is, the more the higher the barrier of entry to something is, the less likely it is that any given person who has then to have this interest and maybe this interest, and then they combine into this new interest and makes them study, I don't know, something technical like energy management. Then this person could talk about this. Now, all the other people would be left out because they could have an opinion, but they wouldn't have to actually say something about this topic. So now the problem is that this is not interesting to most people. Most people are usually within the Gaussian curve. So most people, this is the distribution for many things. Most people fall in here. And these people here are not very interesting to most people, because these people, when it comes to a certain topic, let's say energy management in winter, which is not that specific, but now it is more interesting to more people because it is just concerning more people, it's just not interesting to all of these people. So therefore, by slimming down the interest, you get rid of audience. You could also say it's targeting. In terms of advertisements, it is targeting. By getting rid of all the people that would not be interested in a certain ad, you actually increase the likelihood that someone converts to a purchase, for example, for a given product. When it now comes to media, the more people watch, the more is earned. Now, therefore, why not just get rid of all these different interests and focus on the topics everybody can have an opinion about? Because everybody is not really concerned, but what if it is a topic where everybody actually has to say something about this? Because it also impacts everybody. Now, one of these topics, which should I now delete? I don't know which. One of these topics that now in this format that is made by Zdf is called different things. There are also different elements. I don't want to say this is only just one topic, but let's just say there are more and more numbers where people, so as a first thing, more people are suffering from the negative consequences of being overweight than underweight these days. More people are basically suffering from maybe not obesity, but just the negative health consequences of being overweight compared to people still starving on this planet. Now, this is just one fact, but what I want to focus on is the general broader topic of, you could call it the obesity pandemic, you could call it bad food. It's not that it is the same topic, but these are all different factors that maybe contribute to this different topic. Then maybe a product of this, or maybe a side effect, or whatever you want to call it, would be body shaming. If more people are actually more overweight, then of course there is a social reaction to this whole topic. And of course, if there is a social reaction, there is also a social reaction to this topic. And now, because eating is something that many people do, and looking like something because of eating is also something that many people might do. I mean, I don't want to say it's a fact, but I think it is reasonable to assume that there is a correlation between eating and how you look to a certain extent. So now we have all these different topics which are controversial, which also have many opposing camps. And opposing camps are nice because they are the ones that would engage the most. And it's not only traffic these days, it is also engagement, which is how likely is it that somebody, for example, writes a comment or makes a reaction video, just like I am doing now, which is again basically fulfilling one of these loops. Somebody makes something that is controversial, then many people talk about it, which makes it more controversial, because of course there is a selection process going on, because only the people that are very engaged with this topic will then make something. Therefore, there is a selection process. And with every cycle, you could argue that the polar opposites grow to more polar sides. And if you now take one of these topics, and you make a video about it and you put it on YouTube and you cut it down to 20 minutes, for example, and you add audio and video, not audio and video, but audio and also sounds. Sounds are also audio, but visuals, for example, you just make it more hyper real. Then, of course, you are kind of using all of these different things. But this is not the purpose of the state TV. But at the same time, the state TV somehow has to stay relevant in order to also reach audiences. So there is a compromise to be made. And in this whole compromise, Zdf decided to make now this format and to therefore hit different target audience probably, because people like me are not watching TV. I haven't watched linear TV in like a year, for example. I sometimes watch the news, but I watch the news actually from German state TV, actually also on YouTube. I don't even go to the dedicated website anymore because they now also upload the news to YouTube, because that's just where the video is, and that's also where the attention is. Another method of maybe skewing the audience's perception of something like a public discussion is this. If you now don't talk about this whole obesity topic, but instead you talk about climate change, for example, and most climate scientists are probably agreeing here. Most climate scientists are probably agreeing that the climate change is to a certain extent man-made. Now there are a few who don't agree. And because this is kind of a polarity now again, and let's just now say this is the man-made part. Scientists agree that climate change is man-made, and this is the other part, where they don't agree. Now the question is, if you have a discussion on TV, it is really boring now if you just have, because it doesn't look like this, but it looks more like this. The people on this side are basically, the distribution is more on this side, I would say, therefore it makes more sense to view the polar opposite in the middle here. The question now is, how many people do you invite of each camp? In order to get the actual representation in the real world, you maybe would have to invite, let's just say and assume it would be 80% that actually agree climate change is man-made, and 20% that are on the other side that say it is not man-made. And even though I just wrote it wrong for you, it of course has to be like this. Then ideally you would have people in these percentages. But now this is very complicated, and how many do you take, for example? You could, for example, take 4 here and 1 here. Then it would be cool. If you want to slim it down, you can't, because you can only then have here 0.5 to then still represent the actual scientific overview, not scientific overview, but the scientific consensus on this topic. You would only have half of a climate scientist. But you cannot have half of a climate scientist, therefore you have to have at least 4. But what now happens if you cannot get 4? What now happens if you invite 4 and there is only 1 on the other side? Everybody says, well, it's kind of unfair that there are 4 people here and only 1 person here. This 1 person has to argue against all of the others, and also within this here, within the people who don't agree that climate change is man-made, even though I kind of skewed it up. I now drew them on the opposite sides. What I'm trying to say is that there might also be different views within this camp, and there also might be different views within this camp. The problem is that you now have to have at least 5 people, and you cannot have a one-on-one discussion with somebody who doesn't agree climate change is man-made and somebody who does agree, because this is just not representing the actual facts. Now, of course, people are not usually representing the actual facts, and in a discussion somebody might agree on something, somebody might say something, something might be conveyed as something that was not the intent. And so you have all these different factors going on, and if you then again return to this topic, to the topic of obesity, and you now apply all of these different concepts, the concept of shortening, the concept of making it hyper-real also by shortening, making it more controversial in order to get more attention and also to get more discussion and also to still just be relevant. And then you invite, out of these 6 people, potentially, out of these 6 people, and plus the moderator, what if now they don't represent the consensus, but instead 6 of these people, or 5 of these people, plus the moderator, argue for one specific view, mostly, and only one person argues against them. Then you have all the ingredients, not for disaster, but for skewing the audience's perception, but also for then making people like me, or turning people like me basically into reaction. For making people like me then do also something like this video on this topic. And therefore it partially has fulfilled its purpose of reaching its target audience.